Hi, I am Jennifer McFadden, Associate Director of Entrepreneurial Programs here at the School of Management at Yale, and I am delighted today to have Brad Hargreaves join us as a guest. Brad is the founder and CEO of Common, which is dedicated to making housing better by providing flexible, community-minded, shared homes. Previously, he co-founded General Assembly, a global education institution with campuses in more than 15 cities worldwide. As part of the General Assembly founding team, Brad led the growth of the company's education business from its launch in 2011 into a global institution with over a dozen campuses. More recently, he was a venture partner at Maverin, General Assembly's lead investor. Brad has been named to Vanity Fair's The Next Establishment, Inc. magazine's 30 Under 30, and Business Insider's Silicon Alley 100. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about the program on entrepreneurship and how we fit into the overall ecosystem of things that are going on at Yale related to entrepreneurship and innovation. We're going to take a quick look at Lean Startup methodology, which is the methodology that we use in my class, Founders Practicum, here at the School of Management, and then dive into some questions with Brad so that he can talk through how he has applied some of the Lean Startup methodology to founding several of his startups, and in general just speak about how you take an idea and bring it into the market. So just to give you a sense of where we fit within the university, the program on entrepreneurship was launched in 2014. We are essentially the curricular side of entrepreneurship on Yale's campus. We offer the significant majority of courses that are open to students, not just at the School of Management, but across all of Yale, that provide them an opportunity to get both an introduction to entrepreneurship through courses like Entrepreneurship and New Ventures, all the way through to Founders Practicum, which is the course that I run, which is really focused on School of Management students or joint degree students having an opportunity within the classroom to explore a venture and work on that while they're here at the School of Management. In addition to the courses that are offered here, we have a number of colleagues from across campus that offer more specialized courses, whether it's the folks over at CBAE at the Center for Business and Environment at Yale, or in the engineering department and at the Center for Engineering and Innovation Design. There are now a number of courses that are specifically there to either help students get products off the ground, launch new ideas, or really try to bring a venture out into the world while they're here at Yale. In addition, there is obviously, as many of you probably know, a new organization on campus called Sci-City that was launched over the summer that was funded by Joe Tsai. And that organization really has as its overarching goal to be the place centrally within the university where students can go and explore everything from how do you create a new art project and bring that into the world to how do you take something out of one of Yale's labs and create a high-tech, high-growth venture. So there are a number of programs that are being run out of Sci-City this year that are new. There are some that have evolved from the previous iteration of what was kind of the precursor to Sci-City, which is the Yale Entrepreneurial Institute, which both Brad and I were there for the founding days of. A lot of the student-facing programs that are now available at Yale are focused within that center and include things like semester-long accelerators where students get $1,000 to and mentorship over the course of the semester to work on their venture, to new ideas coming out this semester which are more focused intensives around podcasting, fake news. There's one around urban art, biomedical engineering, and food. And there are 8 of those in total, and they just give students an additional opportunity from the extracurricular perspective to take a deeper dive on particular topics of interest. So before we jump into really a Q&A between Brad and I about his business, I wanted to give you a little bit of a framework that we use in the Founders Practicum to help students take their ideas and bring them into the market. So that class really is largely framed around the Lean Startup methodology, which can be applied both to for-profit and nonprofit ventures, and both to high-tech, high-growth ventures and more traditional consumer-facing products that people might be launching. In that class, we do have a wide range of ventures, both social ventures, nonprofits, high tech, high growth. We've had everything from semiconductor materials to acorn-fed pork. And so it really does give students an opportunity to work on whatever project they decide. So the idea around lean startup methodology really is this evolution from the way that things traditionally would have been done, say back in 1998, where if you were going to launch a high-tech, high-growth venture, you would spend months and months and months putting together a business plan. You'd come up with your idea. You'd spend months putting together a business plan. You'd go out and you'd try to raise a great deal of money. You would take that money and then you would execute and scale. And the issue with that is that oftentimes what you would see is that you had founders who were going out who were raising enormous amounts of funding, including, if you look at Webvan, that's one of the typical examples that people use. They raised over $800 million before they actually even talked to a customer to validate whether or not the idea that they were trying to put out into the world was something that was useful in solving a real problem. So instead of doing that, what you see now is a lot of founders, and clearly there are places where the lean startup methodology is not as applicable. Pharmaceuticals is one example sometimes. But where you see founders really instead of going out and doing that, trying to have earlier contact with customers and then integrating that into their early decision making. So you see this idea where you have a founder who sets this vision, and within that vision, it could be something like, for us, I founded a company, Skill Crush, and we teach women how to code. And so we had a very specific reason for doing what we were doing and a vision for how we wanted to bring that into the world. And then you take that vision and you break it down and create basically what are falsifiable hypotheses around very different parts of your business model. So if you think about what a business model in general is it's really defined as an integrated array of distinctive choices, specifying a new venture's unique customer value proposition and how that venture will configure all of the activities that they do to deliver value and earn sustainable profits. And so what you really want to do is come up with this idea, then you come up with a set of hypotheses around these different elements of your business model, and then you create what are called tests or MVPs to test those various parts of your business model. And from those tests, you gather information that will essentially help you make decisions. So the MVPs are really small tests that validate or invalidate all of these hypotheses that you have. And really the goal of lean startup methodology is essentially to avoid waste. So you want to validate these hypotheses as quickly as possible and using the least amount of resources. Some people can say that lean startup methodology leans on some other frameworks, and I would certainly agree with that. You're essentially applying what traditionally had been done as the test then invest within larger corporations from a product development perspective to startups. The methodology also relies heavily on frameworks, including Steve Blank's customer development process, agile software development, design thinking, and lean manufacturing, where you're focusing on small batches and rapid prototyping. I think the one key differentiating factor between those previous methodologies and what is trying to be accomplished within the lean startup methodology is that this idea of testing, learning, and iterating is applied not just to the product development process, but also to other elements of your business model. So when we help students think through kind of what those other elements are, we tend to rely on a business model canvas, which can seem somewhat reductionist when you first see it, is essentially this grid that has a number of boxes in it. And within that, you detail all of those things that you assume about your business. So who do you think your key partners are? What key activities do you think that you'll be doing on a daily basis? What do you think your value proposition is? What problem are you trying to solve for your customer? What is your specific product or service that you're trying to deliver? Who are those initial customers? And what is that relationship? What does that relationship look like that you have with those customers? How do you get them? How do you keep them? How do you grow them? What channels do you use to actually reach out to those customers and to deliver your goods? How are you generating revenues, and what are the costs associated with those revenue streams? And so what we do, initially in the class is really encourage those students who typically come into the class with an idea to really start to map that out within this framework and then to build out a set of falsifiable hypotheses. So what exactly do I mean when I say that? I think a good example I can give is from Rent the Runway, where if you're not familiar with the business model, they essentially were renting high-end dresses to women, and they needed to validate a set of hypotheses before they really decided to make a lot of large investments in building their platform, in trying to find customers, et cetera. And so what they did was they went out and they first tested the hypothesis that women would be willing and interested in renting high-end apparel to begin with. And so they did this by doing a pop-up at Harvard. They were both Jenny Hyman and Jenny Fleiss. Jenny Fleiss is a Yale College grad. Were both students at Harvard at the time. And they essentially hosted a pop-up where they had women come and try on dresses and rent dresses. And so they validated the hypotheses that women would be willing to rent dresses to begin with. And once they found that, they kind of set a metric that was a goal for them to say, all right, this is a no-go, go decision. If X number of or percentage of the women who try on dresses rent, then we know that this hypothesis is validated. And so at the time, the first pop-up that they did, 34% of the people who came rented dresses. And the second one that they did, 75% of the women rented dresses. And so that kind of answered that one key question, which was people's willingness to actually rent dresses. Then they still really had to go out and test whether or not people, because the women were able to at that point try on the dresses, they had to test whether or not the women would be willing to rent dresses that they did not have the opportunity to try on. So instead of, again, spending enormous amount, millions of dollars at the time, because this is earlier in 2005 or 2006, before they spent all the money developing a platform and reaching out to key partners who were designers, they actually just sent out a simple PDF via email to a number of women and gave them the opportunity to rent. And out of that email, 5% of the 1,000 people that they reached out to ended up renting dresses. And so that then was an indication to them that they had something and that they should move forward. So that's essentially kind of the basics, lean startup methodology. And I kind of want to jump in and ask Brad a number of questions just so that we can see how he's applied that within the context of his own businesses. So Brad, you've launched 2 companies when you were a student at Yale and have since gone on to launch General Assembly and Common. What is a common thread in all of these ventures?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. It's great to be here, and really excited about the programs and what you're doing at Yale. Yale College grad myself, Trumbull 08. So it's really tough to talk about common threads between the furniture business I started in college, General Assembly, which was an education business, and now Common, which is doing residential real estate. But if I were to name one thread, it would be that they were really all started in a very iterative fashion, where the initial conception of the business was a very simplistic version of what the business eventually became. And that could be intentional, such as I think both General Assembly and Common were that way, or almost incidental. I my sophomore year started a business that actually took antique furniture from institutions like Yale. We actually started with card catalogs and found a market for them online. And this was probably in 2005 when Yale was renovating several of its libraries. We would buy card catalogs, desks, chairs, any kind of antique furniture in bulk and resell it on the internet, which is a fun little business. It never would get that big, but it definitely got me hooked on kind of entrepreneurship as a concept. And we started not saying that like we're going to do this, we're going to go help Yale liquidate its furniture, but actually started because a friend of mine said, hey, look at this. Yale is selling these cool antique card catalogs from Sterling Memorial Library. Let's buy one. And that turned into let's buy 2. Let's keep one in our common room and let's sell one. And they were $50 a pop. And, we hoped we'd get a couple hundred, but we put the second one on eBay and I think it ended up selling for $3,000. So we're like, how many more of these can we buy? And turned out quite a few more. So it was very iterative. It was, there was not really any like plan behind it. And, lo and behold, a year and a half later, Yale ran out of furniture. But that was fun, and it definitely got me hooked. Something like General Assembly, we knew there was a big opportunity in education, but we didn't necessarily know what that was. And kind of, so every step along the way, we started with a very light education product, just an hour and a half in the evening, learn a little bit of JavaScript, learn a little bit of digital marketing. Basically, we called it cocktail party level of, knowledge of these skills. But that was an interesting product in and of itself. So that while it was a prototype, while it was kind of an early lean version, it wasn't a bad product at all. It served a specific audience. It let us start building our pool of instructors. It let us get the operations together, and enabled us kind of within, 4 months to roll out evening programs that taught those skills in a more robust way. Say 8 weeks, 12 weeks in the evening, 2 nights a week. Learn front-end web development, learn UX design, learn data science, not in a way that you could get a job, but in a way that you could add a skill set to your, to your CV. That kind of led us to actually ask the question of like, okay, can we level this up again and get someone a junior level role in one of these fields? So about 6 months after that, we released our first full-time 3-month program in web development that actually got people jobs. So that was kind of the third step, even though today that's what most people know General Assembly for. That was actually the third step in an iterative process. But each step along the way, we had a product that worked for a specific audience. And I think that's, when I think about lean startup methodology and the right way to apply it, your prototype of a car is not a steering wheel. It's a skateboard. Like, it doesn't serve necessarily the same purpose. It certainly doesn't target the same audience, but it's a useful product in its own right. So that evening class wasn't the same thing, didn't necessarily have the same value proposition, certainly not the same price point. But it was, I think in hindsight, the right lean way to prototype an education product, as opposed to, building the first day of our front-end web development course, which would have just kind of not been that interesting. We would have built a steering wheel and not a skateboard, but we started with the skateboard.
Good analogy. I do remember my advertising class that I did, which was quite fun in the early days. Yeah. So can we talk a little bit about the importance of brand? I would say one of the threads, at least for your last 2 startups, so 2 threads I think for 3 of your startups would be community across all of them. Go Cross Campus certainly had a community, but definitely branding as well. So can we talk about the importance of brand, and can you just walk us through the process of creating a brand and then leveraging that brand to find your first 100 customers at General Assembly, and then maybe the same thing with Common?
Yeah, I think brand is immensely important, especially if you're building a B2C business these days. Even if you don't invest in a brand, you still have a reputation. Customers are still going to talk about you. So just thinking about it and building brand in from day one into part of your strategy is absolutely critical. And when I talk about lean startup methodology and making sure your first product is viable, that is, it's not a bridge to nowhere, but it's actually like an interesting, viable product in and of itself. That's really important when you're talking about building brand, because, if you built an MVP, but it doesn't make someone happy, it doesn't actually solve a need for a customer, you're actually really setting yourself back in terms of building a brand. And there is absolutely a tension there between do it right, build a great product that is going to launch your brand in the right way, versus build a very, very minimum borderline viable product that may actually set you back. And I've certainly seen some founders, perhaps start with a different brand, whether they're just trying to be iterative, or they want to go through a rebrand eventually, or they don't want to, be too cautious about what they release and potentially spoil the waters of the brand they eventually want to create. So Common, for instance, when we started, we were called Porchlight. We never opened a building under the Porchlight brand, but it was kind of our working title, and we put up a few landing pages, experimented with different value propositions, ran some light ad campaigns just to see kind of what got people excited. And we didn't want to put that up under the Common brand because, one, we had no design resources, so we were trying to be scrappy about it. And two, we didn't want people to notice and say oh, Common is launching with this crazy thing, and that turned out not to be the product we wanted to go with. So it's really, really tough, balancing brand and lean. Sometimes there's no right answers. Sometimes you have to make hard trade-offs.
Nice. I know that you're a big fan of KPIs. How do you use data to drive decision-making, particularly at the earliest stages of the ventures that you've launched?
Yeah, you always have to base your decisions in some sort of quantitative metric once you get to the place. And kind of I look at the early stages how quickly can we get to a place where we have data to base decisions on? One of the challenging parts for me as an entrepreneur, I come from a science background. I was a molecular biology major at Yale, is that the confidence threshold that you should have in business is very different than the confidence threshold that you should have in science. And it actually varies based on the type of business you're in too. So using a 95%, interval, it's great if you're in science. That's the standard. If you're working at Facebook or Google and you have immense amounts of data flowing through your test, that might make sense. If you're at an early stage startup, there's absolutely no way. So adjusting your level of confidence at which you're willing to make a decision is, I think, a really important part of early stage prototyping and getting yourself off to the right foot.
Yeah, we just said in our class that 60% is the new 80% when you're trying to start something. So you got to get 60% there.
If you're right 60% of the time,
you're doing well.
If you're right 60% of the
you're
time,
doing incredibly
in the
well.
early days, you're doing great. You're doing great.
So one of the critical components that's common, obviously, across all successful ventures is a great team. Can you speak a little bit about how you found your early co-founders, or you found your co-founders for your team, and then your early team members, and how you think about recruiting?
Yeah. The way I like to think about it is, where am I weak as an entrepreneur given the idea I'm going after? What skill set or what kind of psychographic, and that's why kind of sometimes being in a somewhat more corporate environment for a while can make sense, because, in that environment, you can often know kind of where you're good and, where you're lacking. And not just from I don't have this skill set perspective, but from here are my own weaknesses. Here's where I'm not as good as a leader. And you really have to combine those. So going into Common, I knew I was weak on the real estate side. I had done product, I had done technology, I had done operations. I'd never done real estate. I didn't know how to, build financial models around real estate products. I didn't really understand a lot of the moving pieces, how the financing worked. It was all pretty foreign to me. So my first two hires were both people with deep finance and real estate experience. And, I made the decision that I wasn't going to go with a traditional co-founder. I was going to kind of create a big options pool and use that to incentivize my first, 10 or 20 employees, which that made sense for me in the business I was starting. So brought in, two people, one who had done a lot of real estate projects, in about, 5-10 years of work experience. And then someone else on the other end of the spectrum, who had a deep finance background, including real estate, who was in his early 60s. So it was kind of an interesting team, very non-traditional startup team, but it worked well for our needs and what we were going after. It's so situational, and it's a hell of a lot better if you have self-awareness and know yourself.
Yeah, totally. So both Common and General Assembly are hybrid real estate community plays. How do you think strategically about creating those communities? What are the risks in getting it wrong, and where have you really seen both across both of those ventures something that you've done create magic?
Yeah, so I look at this and I think, the communities were very key for both General Assembly and Common. But in some cases, outside observers actually overweight the importance of that to the success of the venture, or put the cart before the horse and say, I want to create a community first and a product second. The product has to come first. These people don't buy into a community in the abstract. So they're not, it's very, very tough to sell that. I think a lot of people have tried to go down that route of like, oh yeah, we're a community, and then there's like some product lumped onto it. General Assembly worked because General Assembly offered great and effective education products. Common works because Common is solving a housing need in urban centers. The community is like the stickiness, the glue, the je ne sais quoi. Like it's that thing that's on top that kind of makes the whole thing, takes it from a very transactional product to a magical experience. But you have to have a great product. Like there's no other way to do it. Like if you just have a community and no product, then you're like, you're Billy McFarland running the Fire Festival. Like you shouldn't be in business. So I don't know what to say other than like start with the product, get the product right, and then create spaces where community can thrive. And you have to be, and this is still something I struggle with sometimes, is like what role should the company, should the organization, should the brand play in the community? I think the best communities are so organic and don't feel like the brand or organization is encouraging them, but simply naturally happen, and the participants in them view them as like, oh, cool, like I know these people, I happen to know these people as a part of Common, but it's just so. It's not because Common is a great organizer of community. So if you can do that and pull that off, you can create a much stickier product. But the product has to be good.
Yeah, no doubt. So this is your fourth venture. How have you evolved as a CEO since that first furniture venture? And then what are the things that you wish you had known when you launched that first venture? And what are you most proud of kind of understanding now, I suppose? Or where do you think you excel now?
Yeah, totally. And while it's true that this is my fourth venture, it's the fourth venture that people are aware of. It's one thing to keep in mind as you're an entrepreneur and you're thinking about prototyping in an early stage. There's a lot of things I've tried that just like didn't work at all, and were just kind of like either never launched or like those early prototypes just like did not come back with good results, and so you don't hear about. Yeah. So, yes, fourth. That's actually and not that all four worked. I mean, my Go Cross Campus, my gaming venture, unfortunately, went bust in 2009. So it's not like four worked. And certainly there's more below the surface there that, try out, run an experiment or two. Whoop, that didn't work. Move on to the next one. So there's a lot of iteration in that's not necessarily visible. So I do have to note that for every entrepreneur that's out there trying things, prototyping, like you're not going to be successful even 3 out of 4 times of ideas you have. Like if you have 20 ideas and 3 of them work, like that's actually pretty good. That's really good. Yeah. So in terms of like, I think if there's anything that I could go back and like tell my earlier self, like 18-year-old Brad selling furniture, it's like, it's never as good as it seems nor as bad. Like, yeah. I think the biggest difference between the entrepreneur I was, 12, 13, 14, however many years ago, and the entrepreneur I am today is that I think I'm a lot more even-keeled today. I don't know if I'm any smarter, but I'm certainly like more balanced, and like I tend to get freaked out less. It's like there's huge swings up, huge swings down, and the more I think as a CEO you can buffer yourself against those swings through like trying to balance yourself, the better. So it's never as good as it seems, nor is it as bad.
Okay, so you advise a number of founders. What advice do you typically give during that first meeting with someone who's interested in launching a new venture?
Sure. I mean, a lot of it really gets into iteration, that first prototype. Usually when I sit down with very early stage entrepreneurs, a lot of it comes down to, what is that first prototype? What is that first iterative step that you need to do to get some proof points behind the business, to start building an audience, to start making money if that's an option. And there's a few kind of tricks that I often use. I mean, I'm a big fan of email first businesses.
Yeah, we did that.
I really challenge a lot of Yeah, it's great. I wrote that from early Skill Crush days.
Yeah.
It's a great way to start building. I mean, email, as much as it's been around for 25 years, is still a wonderful way to reach people. And there's a lot of great email first businesses out there that were started via email for a while. How do you brick and mortar prototype something? Actually create events and in-person interaction, which is a lot easier often to prototype than building a software product. So a lot of my advice for the companies I advise really, comes into, are there ways that you can get from 0 to 1? Because you could build no product. You could just have an email list that has 1,000 highly engaged subscribers. Yeah. And suddenly you're 10 times more fundable. You're 10 times more interesting for an engineer to join your team. If I'm a software engineer and I'm thinking about, which of these dozen MBA students do I want to jump on and build their product? Having 1,000 people engaged on an email list, that's the number one thing I'm going to look for. Oh, wow, people actually want this. If I went and spent a long weekend and built this product and built a prototype, there's actually users who would be on this from day one. So that's, trying to just drive in and be so rigorous about how do you prove it out with the least possible work.
Great. So I want to jump to some of the questions from the people who are online. The first question is, and maybe you could apply this to one of the ventures or across a couple, which variables through the prototypes should you try to hold constant when you're testing something, when you're going through that testing process?
It's an interesting question. Obviously, it's very situational. It depends on, what exactly you're testing. What are you trying to prove? And frankly, most founders don't have the luxury of running multiple tests where you can, hold some variables constant and flex others. Most have kind of one shot to go at it, and it's very binary. It either works or it doesn't.
Yep.
And so it's kind of a question that most founders don't have the privilege of actually asking. I would say your own interest is probably a pretty important one to hold constant, because and I've actually faced this in a few of my businesses where you run a few experiments and the data's pointing you in a direction that might work, but I really don't want to spend that much time running that business. That's
Totally.
Not something that's interesting to me. And certainly if if you're pre-investment, if it's just you working on the idea, or a small team, and y'all just get together and be what, maybe this would work if we built a business doing X, but are we all really excited about signing up for spending 5 to 10 years building a business doing X, and no one's really excited about that? Maybe the results of the test don't matter.
Yeah, I totally agree. Can you walk us through the fundraising process, and would you recommend bootstrapping as long as possible, and what is that right time to start looking for investors?
Yeah, once again, this is a question where there is no answer. It's entirely situational. Look, I mean, general rule of thumb is bootstrap as long as you can. But a lot of people don't have the luxury, don't have the privilege of doing that. So I think it's sort of obnoxious to sit up here and say like bootstrap, bootstrap, bootstrap. What I would say is like, think about as many alternate ways of financing your business as possible. So like, the dichotomy that's made of like bootstrapping versus venture capital is really a false dichotomy. And there's unfortunately a lot of like paths to financing a business, from, angel investors to small business loans to grants to frankly getting a first customer that's willing to pay up front. Yeah. Maybe it's actually, you sign up that first customer and, they're willing to take a risk and pay you up front. You give them a couple of points of warrants in your company. Like, get creative about it. General Assembly, we didn't raise venture money until we were really off to the races. We had a small angel investor write a check. We got a grant from New York City EDC, Economic Development Corporation, for building out a co-working space. A bunch of members of that co-working space put in their deposits and paid up front. We got some sponsors, like, some law firms, and like Rackspace wrote us a big check. I think like Skype donated the TVs. Like, it just, I don't know. We hustled, and fortunately we didn't take dilutive capital until pretty far along.
Yeah. So here's one more question. Does mobile simplify or complicate the process of starting a lean venture or starting in a lean way?
Generally, I think it simplifies. It puts you directly in contact with your customer. It simplifies design in many ways. But once again, very situational. Depends on the business you're actually starting. I know, if we had taken, go across campus, my gaming company that I started in 2008, and if mobile gaming were a big thing then, I think that would have been a much simpler in business and would have been much more likely to succeed had we built it on top of a mobile platform. General Assembly, on the other hand, I think goes the other direction. I mean, we had a simple business. We were teaching people things in Meet Space, and like that would have been more complicated if we had put it on, try to figure out how like mobile works. So it's pretty situational. I do like mobile, as I think it simplifies some of the communication channels.
Okay, so what markers do you use to determine when to either pull the plug on an idea or to move on to the next thing? Again, this is going to be a situational question, but worth taking a shot.
Yeah, I think it goes back to your interest and motivation. Like, a business is not dead until the founder gives up on it. Yeah. And like, there's going to be swings and peaks and valleys. But, I more commonly see founders stick with something too long than give up on something prematurely. And that's not the case across the board. But, you can keep pounding your head into the wall for a long time. Yeah. And I think in some ways accelerators, not to diverge too much, but I think accelerators can actually make this worse, not better.
I would say venture can as well.
Because venture certainly can.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people look at accelerators as like, I'm going to get to like a proof point sooner or late, like sooner, as opposed to just like plodding away on something myself. It doesn't always work that way. I found that I've seen several founders who like want to make pivots, decide not to make those pivots because they need to be ready for demo day. So they stick with an original flawed idea. And I really, really discourage founders from doing that.
So I will give you one of the questions that I got from one of my students. When you first launched, did you have a personal network to help you get your idea off the ground? And if so, how did you leverage them? And if not, how did you go about building that network?
Yeah, so I think for Common, at least, a great question. I think for Common, at least, I had the worst of all scenarios there, which is I didn't have a personal network that meaningfully helped me, other than initial investors, which I guess I should acknowledge, that I was totally lucky in being able to have a business that was already successful and people that were willing to jump on board and fund me. But in terms of customers, I was in the worst situation because I thought I had a personal network that would be useful, and turns out I didn't. And what do I mean by that? Well, I kind of assumed that like my relationships with like tech boot camps, with programs that were bringing people here temporarily, would actually be a big customer base for Common. Turns out totally not the case. That's not our customer. We want longer term people who are coming here for work opportunities, people from outside the city. So it's actually a pretty different audience than what we originally assumed. So that sort of led us down a false path in terms of our customer base. And frankly, we're a supply constrained business, where this is less dependent on reaching a specific kind of renter pool and more about building relationships with developers, real estate developers, that can get us the kind of inventory we're looking for. And if that inventory exists and it's quality and it's at the right price, you don't need special relationships to fill it. So I had to really begin kind of building relationships with real estate people from the ground up, which took quite a while and is kind of still in process. But before I even did that, I had to figure out who the right people were, because it's not obvious going into a new industry like real estate, who even are the people I should be meeting? Like, okay, real estate developers, well, that sort of makes sense, but like what size of real estate developer? How does the ecosystem work? What do they care about? So answering all those questions was really important to like building those first few relationships.
How did you go about doing that?
Well, you start meeting people. I don't know the hack around this. There's no hack. So I had a great network of venture investors. We were really fortunate that venture investors, a lot of their LPs are into real estate. So I actually got introduced to a lot of their limited partners who were big real estate funds. Now, those people were actually not the right first partners for us, because these were huge institutional, either family offices, like big real estate investors. And, we wanted to prototype with a brownstone in Brooklyn. Yeah. We didn't want a huge commercial building in Midtown Manhattan, which is what a lot of these people dealt with, the kind of real estate people that are limited partners to a venture fund. So then we kind of had to hop, skip, and a jump, find somebody who had a friend who was buying brownstones in Crown Heights. And we were fortunate to get a deal done. And actually another one of our real estate partners came from, a good friend of mine who's like former business partner was now doing real estate deals. So it's just, I don't know. There's no shortcut. You just got to pound the pavement.
Yeah. Do you think that young entrepreneurs put too much emphasis on the idea versus the execution?
I mean, it's both. There's no, I mean, if you're, if you're Einstein, but you're selling hot dogs for a loss and making up for it on volume, like that's not good. But if you're, if you've got the best idea ever and you have no team to execute, like that's not good either. So there's no answer, idea versus execution. What I would say is that you should start with a thesis and maybe a space that you want to get into.
Yeah.
And just start testing things within that space, start talking to people within that space. So I think young entrepreneurs may value the idea over the sector or thesis. And those things are different. So like I knew that rental real estate, rental apartments in big cities were something I wanted to innovate in, that there was a thesis there that like, millennials in general were having a terrible time, bad user experience, a lot of money left on the table. I knew there was something there long before I knew, okay, this is what Common is, this is what we're going to try.
Yeah. So curious, and I think this is a controversial question a little bit because you hear it a lot, particularly within high-tech, high-growth VC side of things, VC-backed ventures. What is the value of an MBA for an entrepreneur? And you probably do not have the answer to this, so maybe I will go ahead and answer it. We do hear there is a little bit of a stereotype within the tech industry in general that can be negative against MBAs. And I think there are very valuable reasons to pursue an MBA instead of jumping right into it. I think one of the things that you gain, at least I gained personally from coming to the School of Management, is just this overarching perspective, particularly if you've been working in a sector that's maybe the nonprofit sector, which is where I came from, and you need a set of skills that you didn't currently have to build, and also a network of people that you would not have had otherwise. I think it's many times people talk about this question, and it is so personal and situationally dependent, and is related to, what you want out of your future and whether or not you think that entrepreneurship is the only path. What I will say is that starting a venture is incredibly hard. Your probability of success is really pretty small a lot of the times. And having something else to fall back on, whether it is a job at McKinsey or a job at Google, is incredibly beneficial. And I think an MBA opens up those paths. I think also if you look at some of the more successful investors/entrepreneurs out there, people like Chris Dixon, they have MBAs. And then you have cases where, somebody's dropped out of college. So it really is just such a personal decision, and really you need to figure out what fits well within the context of your own life. So I don't know, Brad, if you want to chime in on that at all. But
yeah, I'm actually very pro MBA for people who want to be entrepreneurs. And I think the bad rap they've gotten really comes down to, some of the frameworks and methodologies that are taught in traditional business school being counterproductive in an early stage entrepreneurial environment. But when I was at General Assembly, my co-founder Jake's an MBA, and the frameworks that he knew were incredibly useful, and the way he was able to think really was a great addition as we grew and as we scaled. Yep. So the fallback a lot of people have in terms of the value of an MBA. Well, it's not the classes, it's the network. Yeah, the network's valuable, but actually his ability to think about things like cost of capital, do those analyses, bring frameworks to the table when we're introducing, chewing over strategic problems, actually added a huge amount of value. And I don't think General Assembly would have become what it is had we not. Similarly, my wife and I together, run a few businesses. She really takes the lead on them. While I'm day-to-day at Common. And, she runs circles around me on the finance side, on some of the strategic questions, because, she did go get an MBA. And so I'm actually, like a lot of entrepreneurs, I think, that have only experienced early stage, tend to discount the value of it. And I would have too, 8 years ago when I'd only seen early stage. But now I think my perspective has changed since I've taken things a little bit further.
Yeah, and I would say you mentioned two things that are the classes that I suggest for students to take before they leave the MBA program, which are CorpFin and competitive strategy. I think provide these incredible frameworks and just give you the opportunity to map things out in a way that I certainly would not have been able to do prior to coming to the School of Management. So last question, we can wrap up on this. And I think this is the case both for entrepreneurs and for people who are interested in starting new ventures. We often have various ideas. How do we decide which ideas serve a market need even before building a vision and testing it out or developing an MVP?
That's a really tough one, because I would say the market need is scoped to the specific idea and thesis you're going after. So yeah, you can look at a market at a very high level and do an analysis and just be like, who are the existing players in this market? Who are the customers? Let's go talk to some customers, understand what they're not getting today, and use that to back out an idea. I would say you always have to, once you get to that idea, sort of back test it and say okay, well, there's this big thesis, there's this big pie, but of this idea in particular, what part of the pie could I reasonably take? Have I scoped this so narrowly that I've pretty much cut down my market to nothing? So and it still does come back to like emotional fit too. Like, is it an idea? Is it a concept that like I'm interested in spending 10 years doing? Because it's going to get hard. It's going to take a lot longer than you expect. You hear stories about like, Instagram getting bought at 9 people, for $1 billion. Like that never happened. Like, that's so rare. Upside, even like great stories of companies that got bought for, big numbers, it's often a slog. Like, that company went on for, 8, 10, 12, 15 years. So it's even in a successful scenario, it often takes longer than you expect.
Yeah, totally agree. So when you're starting to go down that process, just to build on that question a little bit, of exploring an idea, how do you you've had 4 ventures that are the ones that we know about, all of those others that you've thought of. What is your process for exploring initially that idea?
I really try to hone in on that test as quickly as possible. I think about some of the ones that fell by the wayside. Why did they fall by the wayside? It might have been, hey, I did 20 interviews with customers and found that either, this wasn't really a need, or, maybe it was a need, but there were a lot of complexities to the sales cycle. One framework that I love to introduce is plot on one axis the lifetime value of a customer, and on the other axis the difficulty of a sale. And you can kind of like draw a line of best fit, where it's like at the upper right you have like Fortune 500 companies, government clients, things like that. At kind of the bottom left you have consumers. You should be above the line on that, like ideally having a lot of value per unit of difficulty of sale.
Yeah.
And I really tend to hate ideas that fall below that line, where you're selling into customers that don't have a lot of money, where the sale is going to be really difficult. So, through simple research, you can usually figure out how much money the customer has and, what potential lifetime value there is. I think where often I try to extract, what I'm trying to figure out in those customer interviews and that test is, how difficult is that sale going to be?
Yeah.
So can I go out and just like scoop up 20 customers, or is this going to be like 6 months of approvals and wrangling and, RFPs and whatnot? So where am I really on that line?
Yeah, I think that's why I encourage our students to try to build, even if it's a rudimentary model, earlier in their idea stage of the venture, because if you're forced to put numbers down on paper and say, all right, well, I think I'm going to be able to sell this product for X, I'm going to sell this number of units, then you can back into how many people do I need on my team to make sure that that sale is going on? How long is that sales process? Is it, pretty quickly? Does it occur quickly, or does it occur over the course of a year? And how much cash would I need in order to get from point A to point B? And I think by actually putting it down on paper, it forces people to think through those things in a way that just kind of not actually looking at the numbers will not allow you to do. So last question, and then we are out. We're done for the day. Any resources that you could recommend for people that we can kind of send off as a takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, I have a list of blogs to read and people I follow. I think you can look at a lot of the the prominent venture investors. I think like Fred Wilson has a really incredible blog that goes into a lot of MBA-like topics and forms a really nice bridge between the things you might be learning in business school and the very practical, on the ground understanding of a business. One tactic I used kind of in the early stage of prototyping my ideas, that's a challenge that I will lay out to the people here who are thinking about an idea, trying to come to an idea. Maybe they have an industry in mind, they have a thesis in mind, but they don't quite have that idea yet. After I left General Assembly, as I was thinking about what I wanted to do in terms of residential, I challenged myself to build a 20-slide deck every week. And it was actually really helpful. Like it doesn't matter like the correctness of some of it, but just like, hey, here's a thesis. I'm going to get it down on 10 to 20 slides. You know, as if I were presenting it, like, does it make sense? Like, let's think through kind of every step along the way. Maybe it's, you know, the business model canvas might be a form of that, but, you know, I just try to do it as simply as possible, and actually was really helpful. And sometimes I go back and I probably made like 15 slide decks. I probably go back and look at those slide decks every few months or so to be like, hey, you know, that's actually not a bad idea, or let's think about what I was thinking about that. So I would just really challenge people to push themselves to kind of create something every week.
Yeah, that's great advice. We definitely use a business model canvas for that as well, and it is this iterative thing where it's not like you're documenting that once and then putting it away in a drawer and not looking at it again. It's you're documenting it, you're going out, you're testing, you're talking to people, you're going back, you're changing, and a lot of it is sequential, and so you have to think through, you know, what are the things that are most important for me to figure out today that may impact 3 other things that are on this business model canvas, and change my idea in some way or another. So,
right.
Brad, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and we encourage you guys who are out there to give it a try. I mean, I think we're in this environment now where there's no better time to try to get something off of the ground. You don't necessarily have to burn all the boats and go all in. You can try something on the side, just get a small project up and out. There are a ton of resources available online. One of my favorite books that's for customer discovery was written by this guy, Giff Constable, called Talking to Humans. And it's just a short, quick look at how you go out and think about structuring those conversations with your earliest customers and potential partners, et cetera. But also great books by Brad Feld. Lean Startup by Eric Ries is a good introduction to the Lean Startup methodology. And I encourage you just to kind of think deeply about a problem and then go and try to test as quickly as possible whether or not your solution or potential solution really solves a need for people. But thank you, Brad, for joining us. We appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Jen, and thanks everyone for joining.
All right. Bye-bye. What?
That was really good. Thank you.
Was it good?